Stop making boring text animations, because today we're going to learn how to make each one of these creative text animations, and along the way we're going to learn some really useful techniques, so pay attention. So this is the first text animation, so let's learn how to do it. For starters, I have our text layer inside of After Effects and we're using the font Bubbly extra bold oblique. What I'm going to do now is hit X to cut this layer. I'm going to come into this composition, I'm going to hit V to paste that layer in, and then I'm going to right click and go create shapes from text, and then I'm going to click on this button in our motion tools panel, and that just separates the shape layer into each individual letter. Now I'm going to do the animation on the T so you can see what I did here. So for starters, what I'm going to do is come up to the fill and hold Alt and click on the fill until I get to a linear gradient, and then I'm going to adjust the gradient like this. Then I'm going to hit Alt Shift and P to drop in a position keyframe. I'm going to come to the end here and hit Control Shift P again, and then I'm going to come to somewhere in the middle and drop in another position keyframe, and then I'm going to move that up like this, and then I'm going to move to the beginning and grab the beginning and end keyframes and pull those down like this. Then coming to the middle, essentially what I want the letter to be doing is this kind of anti-clockwise oval movement. So I'm going to pull out the handle like this to the left. I'm going to make sure that it's going in the right direction, and it is. So I'm going to grab this keyframe, and in case you didn't know how I was pulling out these handles, if you hit Control and Alt and hover over the anchor point, you can see it changes to the Convert Anchor Point tool. We can just pull out the handle like this. Then I'm going to grab this keyframe, just do the same thing, pulling out the handle like this to the left. Just adjust this slightly, and then I'm going to select all of these and hold Control and click on these, and that changes them to Auto Bezier keyframes, and this is what we get. The next thing I did with this is add a loop out expression like this, just so that this continues to loop out past the keyframes. Then we can come up and add the echo effect like this, and we're going to change the echo time to 0.08 like this. I'm also going to just move forward so you can see what's happening here. And I'm going to change the number of echoes to 200, and you can see that's pretty intense, a little bit too much for what we're looking for, and that's why we're going to play around with the decay like this. Take it down to something like 0.94. I'm going to change this to composite in front, just so we retain our gradient on the front, and you can see what that does. Pretty awesome, right? So now what I did is simply apply that to all the other text layers, and I've pre-baked this, so I'm just going to delete all of this and show you the pre-baked layers. So I'm going to turn these all back on, and this is what we would have ended up with if we'd repeated the process for all the layers. What I did next was select all of them and offset them by 5 like this, and then I pulled them all across, and this is what we get. And this is a little heavy, so I'm going to turn this to half just so we can preview our final result. The last thing we need here is this background layer. So I'm going to go back into the main comp. I'm going to select our text layer here, and the way we're going to color this is using a curves effect. So this is how I colored it the first time, but I'm going to duplicate this and just show you how I do that. So I'm going to turn this back on, I'm going to reset it, and the way I always work with this is just changing to one of the first colors, and I just mess around with these handles generally. And I would encourage you to do the same thing, because you can get some really interesting results by doing this. So just changing between the color channels and seeing what kind of results you get. So I'm just going to speed through this a little bit, and I got something like this. That's not exactly what we did the first time, but I think you get the point, and you can play around with this yourself to get something you like. So I'm going to delete that. I'm going to turn my original curves layer back on. Then I'm going to jump back into this pre-comp. I'm going to select all of our text layers, hit Control C. I'm going to come back out, hit Control V. And then I'm going to come up to the top and hit Alt and click on our stroke here. And this is actually exactly what we want, a white stroke with 2 pixels. And then I'm going to remove the fill from all of these by Alt clicking until we remove the fill. I'm also going to remove the echo from all of these. Then we're going to select the blending mode to overlay. I'm going to duplicate them, move them to the top, change the color to differentiate, and then we're going to add a fast box blur. I'm just going to add it to one of these like this, change it to 2, hit Control C on the fast box blur, and add it to the rest. And that adds a bit of a glow to the stroke, and I like the way that looks. And then we have an adjustment layer with a noise HLS set to grain and 2% on the lightness. We're going to turn this back on, and this is our final result. And this is quite a heavy effect, but the result is undeniably sexy. Now let's move on to our next text animation, which is more of a bubbly style. So let's start once again with our text layer, and this time we're using the font Cichlids Medium. Let's separate our letters into individual shape layers, just like before. Now we're going to focus on our T. Let's pre-compose it with Ctrl Shift and C and call this T pre. Hit OK, and I'm going to use this button on the Motion Tools panel to crop this composition to the size of the T. But if you don't have this panel, another way you could do it is pre-composing and then going into your composition, clicking on your region of interest, just drawing a region of interest about the size of the layer, and then going composition, crop to region of interest. The only problem here is that you would then have to move your layer back into the right place, which is not ideal, but it is workable. I'm going to undo all of that, so we focus on our T. What we're going to do now is go into our T layer. We're going to click on our T, we're going to change the color to white. We're going to right click on our layer and go layer styles, and we're going to drop an inner glow. Twirl this down, change our color to black, change our blend mode to normal, and our opacity to 85. Then what we're going to do is increase the size of this, something like that. We're going to increase the range to about 90, and then the choke to about 22, and we can probably increase the size just slightly here as well. That looks good. Now what I'm going to do is drop in a shape layer. So I'm going to grab our ellipse tool and I'm going to make an ellipse like this. And I'm going to twirl this down, right click and go convert to Bezier path. That allows us to come in here and just refine this shape a little bit. Just like that, just so it's not completely perfect and looks slightly more handmade. I'm going to hit W and just rotate this slightly. And we're just creating some extra highlights for some visual interest. I'm going to hit Ctrl D to duplicate this, move it down, rotate it again. I'm going to hit S and break the link. I'm just going to scale this up and maybe make it a bit thinner. And now what we would do is repeat that process for all our other letters. But of course, I've pre-baked this, so I'm going to delete all of this. And I'm going to unshine my layers, and here we have all of our text layers. So we're going to continue working with our T, creating a little bit of animation. So if I hit U on our E bubble, you can see we have this animation for all our other letters. So let me show you how I did that. For starters, we're going to come up to our effects and type in warp. We're going to drop in a warp effect. We're going to change it to squeeze, and we're going to set our bend to 0, and we can drop a keyframe on that. Then we can hit Alt Shift and S to drop in a scale keyframe, and Alt Shift and P to drop in a position keyframe, hit U to bring them all up, move to the end of our animation, and paste the original keyframes across, and then drop some keyframes in the middle here. And we're going to mess with our bend, 35 should do. We're going to change our scale to 120, and we're going to shift this layer over a little bit. Now we're going to grab our center keyframes and make the easing really strong, 100% on either side, and this is the result. Now there are a few extra details that we're going to add a little bit later, but for now this is absolutely fine. We're going to move on to our background. So let's click on our background, and the first thing we're going to add is a ramp effect. So let's drop in our gradient ramp, and we just want to change the start and end points to either side like this. Then what we're going to do is add the colorama effect. Let's go into our output cycle and change use preset palette to negative, and this just adds a black and white handle. We're going to grab the black handle and we're going to move it down like this to around there, and then I'm going to increase the cycle repetitions, and you can see what that does. Kind of duplicate this gradient that we've created. So I'm going to set that to 5, and then I'm going to double click on this color. I'm just going to increase the brightness of this so it's not so dark, and that just creates a bit more definition between these gradients. Cool. The next thing we're going to do is animate this. So what we wanted to do is move like this in a negative direction. So I'm going to alt click on our phase shift to drop in an expression, and I'm going to type in time times negative 35, and you can see what that does. And if you look carefully, you'll see that we're actually getting a really cool optical illusion happening here. Because of the interaction between the letters and the background, we're getting this wobbly, bubbly feel to the outside of the text. And I'm not animating anything here. This is simply an optical illusion, and I think that's pretty cool. So let's close this down. And now we're going to add some color before we move on. So for starters, let's turn on this adjustment layer. And I have a couple of effects here, starting with the tritone effect, which just allows you to affect the highlights, the midtones, and the shadows. And these are the colors I put in, and this is the result. Then I added in a noise HLS set to grain, 2% lightness, and I wasn't completely happy with these colors, so I just added in a curves effect because I wanted to warm it up a little bit, and this is the result. Now the other effect I wanted to add to this was a bit of blur and a bit more noise, so let me just turn this layer on. And again, this is just an adjustment layer, and the first effect I added was a Fastbox blur, which blurs everything out, and I set that to 20. Then I added a scatter effect, and you can see that this adds this nice grainy feel to it, and I set that to 40. Now we obviously don't want this all over our text, so what we can do here is double click on our ellipse tool, which adds a mask. We can change the mask to subtract. Let's twirl this down, and we can increase the feather to something like 100, and I want to bring this effect further in towards the text, so the way we can do that is just decrease the mask expansion to something like this, and this is the result. Now for our final tweaks, you can see that for these other letters we have a drop shadow, and we're going to add that onto this layer by adding another layer styles, layer style, drop shadow, twirl that down, and I'm just going to reset this so that we can start from scratch. So we're going to leave this at multiply, but we're going to change this to 60%, and because our light source feels like it's coming from this direction based on the highlights, I'm going to change this to around 60. Then let's increase our distance, let's increase our size to around 50, and let's increase our spread. Something like that should do, and that just separates the text from the background really nicely. Now let's hit U, and if I play this back, you can see that our other layers have a bounce to them, and the way I created that was using this elastic button on our motion tools panel. So what you would do is grab your keyframes, click on this button, and that gives us this elastic controller where you can control exactly how this works. But for whatever reason, this expression isn't actually working. So what I'm going to do is just copy the working expression I have here and paste that on, and I'm going to put this expression into the description of this video so you can grab it too, or you can grab the free version of the Motion Tools panel, which should be working when you click the elastic button. Then I'm just going to paste this to our other properties, and I'm going to come up to the elastic controller and change these all to 40. And then what I'm going to do is open up all of these keyframes like this, and I'm just going to offset them by 2 frames each. And this is the final result. Now, it's come to my attention that a whopping 74% of you watching these videos are not subscribed. Guys, this is a simple transaction. I give you free content, you hit that subscribe button to support this channel so I can keep giving you free content. So, if you're watching this right now and you haven't subscribed, you know what to fucking do. Now we're going to create this shiny, twisty text, and to achieve this result requires us to stack a bunch of effects and techniques, so you'll see we have a bunch of nested comps. So let's get to the bottom comp. And this is what we're aiming to achieve in here, but we're going to start from scratch so you can see how I did it. The first thing we're going to do is make this 3D, and that'll open up our 2 views. So we have this top view and this front view. Now what we're going to do is twirl this down, go to geometry options, change our extrusion depth to 300, and this is what we get. Then we want to add a bevel to this, so we're going to change the bevel style to convex and the bevel depth to 10. Now it's all black, so we won't really see the bevel, but let's go in and change that. So we're going to click on our text, click animate, side, color, RGB, and that's going to add a 100% red to this. So we're going to leave it like that. And then we're going to click on our animator again and go animate, bevel, color, RGB, and we're going to change this to fully green by copying, pasting that number into just our green and removing our red. And there we have it. Then what we're going to do is change the color of our text to fully blue. So we're going to paste that number in again, and there we have it. Now what we're going to do is hit R to open up our rotation properties. We're going to drop in a keyframe for X. We're going to move to 1 second and 12 frames. And we're going to change this to -1. We're going to come to 3, and we're going to change this to -2. Then we're going to select all of this and add a 60% easing on either side, and this is what we get. Now what we're going to do is center our anchor point, and hit A on our keyboard. Because our extrusion is 300, if we make our Z position 150 on our anchor point, you can see that this centers our anchor point in 3D space. We can just move this back for now. Now we have some issues with our spacing between letters here, so what we want to do next is just jump in and between our E and our X, just adjust that spacing slightly so that there's a gap. Do the same with the T. That should be fine. Now we just need to center this again and move it back slightly. Now we're going to hit R on our keyboard to open up our rotation properties. We're going to drop in a keyframe on the X rotation, come to 1 second and 12 frames, do 1 full rotation in the negative direction, making this -1, and coming to 3, making this -2. Then we're going to select all our keyframes and change our easing to 60 on either side, and this is what we get. That's looking good. Now if you're following along, the next thing you would do is pre-comp this layer. So here's the pre-comp, and the first thing I'm going to turn on is this map layer. I'm going to turn off the text so we can see what we're working with. And this is simply a solid with a gradient ramp from left to right. Now let's go to our text 3D pre. Let's turn that on. Let's reset our time displacement. I'm going to turn this on. What this does is displace the time of whatever layer it's applied to according to the map that you give it. So we're going to make that our map, and we're going to change our max time displacement to 0.1, and then we want to make sure that this is set to effects and masks. And if I hit play, you can see what that does. We're displacing this text layer in time. That gives us this twisty feel. And obviously this is quite pixelated, and you'll see if we increase the time resolution what that does. We're basically increasing the FPS by increasing that number. And this does become quite heavy, so I'd only really suggest you increase this when you're ready to render. So for now, we can leave it at that. We'll come back and increase that later. So there you have it. Now what we're going to do is color this text. So let's turn this on, and this is simply a solid the size of the composition with a gradient ramp to start, just from our top right corner to our bottom left, with the black in the top and the white in the bottom. And then once again a colorama effect with a black and not fully white, a 80% gray over here, and I've set the cycle repetitions to 2. And if I hit you can see that I've animated the phase shift with the same spacing as the rotation of our 3D text, from 0 to 1 to 2. So these are going to be in sync with each other. The next effect I added was a curves effect to give the whole animation this nice green color, and then we have a set matte effect, and I'm going to reset this to show you what I did. We're going to take our matte from our text layer, we're going to change the source to effects and masks, and we're going to change from the alpha channel to the red channel. And if I turn off our text layer, you can see what that does. So this is only showing up where we have red on that pre-comp. Now I duplicated that layer 2 times, so I'll turn those both on. With the second duplicate, I changed the matte to the blue channel, and the third, I changed it to the green channel. And then if I hit you can see that was just offset these phases so that they're not in sync with each other. That made the bevel stand out from the front and the front stand out from the side. So you can see these are all offset, and this is the result. Pretty dope. Now what we need to do is pre-comp all of this once again and go into our main comp. So here we are in our main comp, and we're going to start with our background here. So I'm going to turn on our background. I'm going to turn off our text. Once again using a gradient ramp, except this time I used a radial ramp, as you can see, and I just set this to the top right corner. Then I added a duplicate of that original green curves effect. Now let's turn on our BG light. This is set to multiply and its opacity is at 60%. So I'm just going to turn this up and show you what I did here. So turning on our gradient ramp from the top left to the bottom right, and once again I have a colorama, and this is pretty much a duplicate of the bubble colorama that we had. Again, you can see that I was just absolutely obsessed with this gradient ramp colorama workflow, and I was just finding unique ways to use it. So just to give you an idea of how the gradient ramp affects this, essentially where we set these start and end points will affect the angle and direction of our colorama effect. Once again, if I double tap E here, you can see that we have this animating in a negative direction. Next I added a Frostbox blur to blur this out a little bit, and a duplicate of that curves effect, and this is what we get. Then I set this to multiply and hit T to change this to 60, and this is what we get. You could obviously play around with the blending mode. I just like this the most. You can see if something like overlay gives it this much brighter feel, so you can experiment with that. Now let's turn on our text layer. The main thing I added to this is a layer style, once again a drop shadow set to multiply and 50%, and I didn't change anything else except for the size. So by not increasing the distance, you can see that we create a much more centered drop shadow. like this. Let's close that up. Let me show you the vignette. So I'm going to turn that on, and this is very basic. We have a mask, so if I set this to none, you can see it's just a black solid with this mask that I literally drew by hand. Set it to subtract, and then of course added a strong feather to this. Very basic. Now we have this text shine, and what I'm going to do here is set this to normal, change the opacity back up to 100%, and this is just a duplicate of the text main. So if I click on this and solo it, you can see that it's just a duplicate. Now we have a directional blur and a curves layer, so I'm going to reset both of these. Let's turn on the directional blur, and if I increase this, you can see what that does. I'm going to take it up to 150, and I'm going to change the direction to 45, and this is what we get. And then I'm going to turn on this curves layer, and I'm going to solo this so you can see what we're doing. If we leave the channel on RGB and I click and drag up like this and pull this layer down, just add another handle here so we get a nice curve. You can see what we get, and what we're really trying to create is these nice shiny parts here. So the next trick is to change this to screen so that we get rid of the black, and then we can just set the opacity to something like 80%. Now we get a shine that updates according to this text layer. And of course the last thing we'd want to do is go to our text 3D pre and change our time displacement to something like 1000, and then we could come back and just render this out. And this is what that looks like. Now we're moving on to our final text animation with this Liquidy effect. And this is a very multi-layered technique as well. So we're going to start in the lowermost child comp and work our way up from there. So here we have our text layer, and this time we're using Poppins Bold. So all we need to do at this point is pre-comp this layer. So let's go into our pre-comp, and now we have a composition that's only about 2 and a bit seconds long, and I've cut this layer to be half of that. So for starters, we want to make sure that our anchor point is at the bottom of our text, and if you hit Y, you can move this around and make sure that it's in the right position. Then what we're going to do is unlink our scale, and we're going to scale our text from 100 on the Y-axis down to 0 on the Y-axis. Then what we're going to do is duplicate this layer, hit U again, and now we're going to change our anchor point to the top of the layer, and this time we're going to reverse this animation. So I'm going to right click and go keyframe assistant and go time reverse layers, and you can see what that does. Now I'm just going to shift these 1 frame forward so that we create a little bit of a gap in between here. Now to extend this composition, we just need to duplicate these layers and drag them across like this, and now we get a seamless loop. And that just gives us a slightly longer composition to work with. And now what we'll do is pre-comp all of this. So let's go 1 comp up, and here we have our text once again doing everything it needs to. And with this animation, we're going to use a time displacement effect again. So we need our map first. So let's go to our map and turn this back on, turn off our text so we can focus on the map itself. Once again, we're using the same workflow with our gradient ramp and our colorama. So let's turn on our map, which is just a solid. Once again, we have a gradient ramp. Let's just turn off our text to focus on this. So we have a standard gradient ramp, then we have a colorama with a black and a white peg, and this is 2 cycle repetitions, and I've added in a Frostbox blur to blur this out so we get a bit of a smoother effect. And I'm very aware that we could create this in a way that didn't use up so much processing power, just with some shape layers and a Frostbox blur and a motion tile effect. That's just not what I did, so get over it. Let's move on. So let's turn our text opener back on. We're going to reset our time displacement effect. We're going to drop that on, and of course set this to our map and change our source to effects and masks. And immediately we can start to see what's happening here. Our time is getting distorted more in these white areas and less in the darker areas. What we're going to do now is just increase our time resolution to something like 200, and then let's play this so you can see what's starting to happen. And you can see because of the internal animation on this text that we're starting to get something really interesting happening with this delay, and it's starting to feel a bit liquidy, which is really nice. But I don't like these jagged edges, so let's remove those. So first let's turn off our map, and then we can use the classic Frostbox blur and levels effects to remove that. So let's turn on our Frostbox blur, and that's just set to 3, and then we can reset our levels, turn our levels back on, and then we're going to change the channel to alpha, and then just drag these handles in on either side. We want to keep a little bit of the softness so that we don't get very hard edges. That looks good. And you see doing that actually looks a lot better. And if you didn't like these areas here, what you could do is drag these handles in even further like this to make them really close. So actually simply pushing them to where they are a little bit jagged or something like that would probably work. And then you could add a rough and edges effect. So you could drop the rough and edges on and decrease the fractal influence down to 0. Just change the border slightly, just like that. And that cleans it up. So you can see things are a lot cleaner that way. Now, before we move on, let's duplicate this and drag it over so we have a bit more time to work with. Now we want to turn on this gradient overlay, but I'm going to uncheck this box first. I'm going to turn that on so you can see what we're working with. Simply a gradient ramp where I've dragged the handles in like this, closer to the center. And then if we click this button here, this is the preserve underlying transparency button. If we click it, you can see that this gets matted to the objects below across the whole composition. Now we're going to add some more visual interest with a fractal noise. So once again, we have a solid with a fractal noise applied. I'm going to reset the fractal noise, turn it back on, and we're going to change this to strings and the noise type to spline. Now what we're trying to do here is just bring out these strings themselves. So the best way to do that is to increase the contrast really high. Something like that should do. And then we can just adjust the brightness slightly to remove some of that gray. Then let's uncheck uniform scaling. I'm just going to decrease the width a little bit to something like 60 and scale the height up slightly as well. But maybe make this -40. That looks good. Now I've added some animation to this, so I'm just going to remove that so I can show you exactly what I did there. For starters, I wanted to animate the evolution of this, so I wanted this to slightly morph as time went on. So to do that, I simply added a time times 50 expression, and you can see what that does. Then I wanted this to move down, so simply animating the offset turbulence is all we need to do. So let's drop in a keyframe for the offset turbulence, move to around 4 seconds, and change this to something like 2000. Then we want to get rid of the black completely, and an easy way to do that is to just use the screen blending mode, which gets rid of it as you can see, and then we can use the preserve underlying transparency button to matte this effect onto our text. And that gives us this really interesting result. Now what we're going to do is hit Ctrl+C on our fractal layer, and we're going to go up to our main comp. Now I'm going to hit Ctrl+V to add that back in, and then in order to see it, let's turn on our background layer here, and that is simply a solid with an almost black and a very dark gray gradient. Now if I unsolo this and then hit T, we can change this to 5%, and sometimes an interesting thing to do with backgrounds that match the foreground like this is to scale it up slightly, so 110. And you can see that that slight scale creates a separation between the text and the background. Now I want to add some inner shadow to this text, and the way I'm going to do that is by hitting Ctrl+D on our text layer to duplicate it, changing the name to inner shadow, and then what we can do is add the effect simple choker. I'm going to click that on, and I'm going to solo this layer so you can see what it does. If I increase this, you can see that it just starts cutting into the alpha channel of this layer. So let's make this 25. Let's solo our text layer as well, and now I'm going to right click and add the layer style inner shadow to this. Now let's change the angle to something like this so it feels like our light source is coming from this direction. Then I'm going to change this to normal. I'm going to change our color to a light gray. Then I'm going to increase the distance to something around 20 and increase the size to something like 20 as well. And now you can see we're getting this nice inner shadow effect. The last thing we need to do is just set our transparency to 35%, and there we have our final result. I'm going to unsolo these layers because the last thing we need to do is add our color. So we have this adjustment layer, and of course we're going to use a curves effect. So I'm going to turn this on so you can see, because the last thing we need to do is add some color. So let's go up to this adjustment layer, let's turn it on. You can see where this ended up. You can of course play around with the curves effect however you like, or copy what I did with my RGB curves right here. The last thing I did was add a glow effect, and this is very subtle because I really cranked up the glow radius on this because I wanted the glow to be really soft. You can see that's a very subtle effect, but it adds a little something. And this is our final result. Drop a like if you found this tutorial valuable, and if you liked learning these techniques, then check out the Pro Motion Techniques Masterclass. Learn how to create this rad animation while learning pro techniques and a workflow that you can implement on every new project to exponentially improve. If you feel like your work has been stagnating, or you want something to shake things up so you can start making some next level work, this is for you. It's also super affordable, so stop wasting time and grab it at the link in the description. And don't forget to subscribe for more MotionXP.